On a warm July afternoon, the local community pool was alive with the kind of energy only summer could bring. Families had spread blankets on the grass, children lined up for popsicles at the concession stand, and the sound of splashing echoed against the concrete walls. It was the town's centerpiece, the place where everyone gathered when school was out and the heat pressed down. That day, it looked and felt like every other day of the season, ordinary, safe, filled with laughter. No one had reason to believe it would end any differently. Near the deep end, a 9-year-old boy darted in and out of the water with the kind of unrestrained energy that made adults both smile and worry. He was known for being fearless in the pool, daring himself to hold his breath longer each time, challenging friends to see who could swim to the bottom fastest. His parents had taken their usual spot in the shade, close enough to watch, but far enough to let him play freely. To them, it was routine. Their son loved the pool, and with lifeguards posted on the tall white chairs and dozens of other families around, it felt like the safest place he could be. But sometime between the blur of splashes, the voices calling out Marco Polo, and the hum of lawnmowers from the nearby park, the boy vanished from sight. At first, his parents didn't panic. Children ducked under the water all the time, disappearing for a few seconds before breaking the surface again. They waited, scanning the water, expecting to see his head bob up, his smile wide and unbothered. Seconds turned into a minute. Their eyes darted to the pool's edges, to the diving board, to the ladders on each side. There was no sign of him. The first surge of unease crept in when his mother stood, calling his name over the laughter of other kids. She scanned the pool, her tone rising with every unanswered call. A lifeguard blew a whistle, sharp and sudden, ordering everyone to stop swimming. At once, the mood shifted. The joy that had carried the afternoon evaporated as whistles pierced the air, and children clung to the edge while adults pulled them out onto the deck. Within moments, the pool was cleared. What had once been filled with splashing bodies was now eerily still, the water disturbed only by the quick movements of lifeguards diving in. They fanned out, scanning the bottom, diving deep, resurfacing with nothing. The boy's father ran the perimeter, shouting his name, searching behind chairs and concession stands, his voice growing hoarse with every unanswered cry. Panic set in as seconds stretched to minutes, each one heavier than the last. Witnesses later recalled how quickly the atmosphere flipped from laughter to dread. Parents gathered their children close, whispering about kidnappers, about how someone could have slipped in and taken him while the water was crowded. Others swore they saw him dive under near the deep end and never come back up. The conflicting accounts only heightened the confusion. His mother trembled at the edge of the pool, clutching her chest, insisting she had just seen him seconds earlier. Her disbelief grew into hysteria as lifeguards climbed out empty-handed, shaking their heads. The police were called immediately, sirens cutting through the sticky summer air. Officers rushed in, ordering the gates locked and no one allowed to leave. They moved quickly, checking bathrooms, locker rooms, the small shed where equipment was stored. Nothing. A few officers fanned out into the park, combing through picnic tables, trees, and the walking trail that wound behind the pool. Still, no trace. Back at the water's edge, divers from the fire department suited up. If he had drowned, they reasoned, the body had to be there. The pool was not so large that something could go unnoticed, yet dive after dive turned up nothing. The water was murky from the sudden panic of dozens of swimmers exiting at once, but visibility improved as time passed. Still, no small figure at the bottom, no clothing, no sign at all. The crowd outside the locked gates grew restless. Parents clutched their children, whispering about how quickly things could change, how a place they had always trusted could feel suddenly sinister. Rumors spread in real time. He had been taken, he had wandered off, he had slipped through a gap in the fence, but none of it explained why his towel and sandals still sat neatly folded on the chair where he'd left them. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the deck. The boy's parents refused to leave, their eyes locked on the pool as if staring hard enough might make him reappear. Officers assured them they were doing everything possible, but the lack of answers gnawed at everyone on scene. By nightfall, spotlights were set up, bathing the pool in artificial light. The water glimmered under the beams, deceptively calm, holding none of the answers everyone had hoped it would. When the search paused for the night, there was no closure, only disbelief. A boy had disappeared in front of hundreds of people on a summer afternoon, and despite lifeguards, police, divers, and dozens of witnesses, he was gone. His mother's voice cracked as she pleaded with officers not to stop, her words breaking the silence that had fallen over the pool. It was the kind of moment that marked the end of normalcy for everyone there. What had begun as an ordinary day in the sun had dissolved into the unthinkable, the sudden and unexplained vanishing of a child, leaving behind nothing but questions and a gnawing fear that something darker had unfolded beneath the surface. Within minutes of the frantic calls, sirens wailed down the narrow streets leading to the pool. Police cruisers screeched to a halt outside the locked gates, followed by fire trucks and an ambulance. The first responders moved with sharp precision, quickly assessing the scene. Officers spread across the grounds while firefighters approached the water, speaking briefly with lifeguards before strapping on oxygen tanks. Their goal was immediate and clear: find the missing child before precious minutes slipped away. Divers entered the water methodically, their flashlights piercing through the murk as anxious parents watched from behind the fence. They swept every corner, searching the deep end, the shallow areas, even the lanes marked for lap swimming. Each time they resurfaced empty-handed, the unease thickened. Experienced rescuers knew how quickly drownings could turn fatal, but they also knew that in nearly all cases, bodies surfaced or were located quickly. Here, nothing emerged. The absence itself became chilling. On land, officers combed through the locker rooms, concession areas, and maintenance sheds. Bathrooms were checked stall by stall, storage rooms unlocked and cleared. Every possible hiding place was examined with the same result: empty silence. Outside the pool's chain-link fence, searchers extended their sweep into the adjacent park. They checked under picnic tables, behind the bleachers, along the walking trail lined with trees. Still, no trace. As minutes stretched to nearly an hour, the first interviews began. Police gathered witnesses, moving them into small groups under the gaze of a rising evening sun. Children gave fragmented recollections, their voices trembling. Some insisted they saw the boy dive near the deep end and never come back up. Others were certain he had climbed out, dripping wet, moments before the whistles blew. Adults contradicted one another, their memories blurred by panic. One woman swore she saw him talking to another child near the diving board, while a lifeguard believed he glimpsed the boy near the shallow end ladder seconds before the alarm. The more officers listened, the more the story fractured. When repeated sweeps of the pool yielded nothing, suspicion began to shift. Detectives on scene exchanged uneasy glances. If the boy had truly drowned, they reasoned, his body should have been recovered by now. If he had managed to climb out unseen, where had he gone? And if he had been taken, how had a stranger slipped through a locked gate in the middle of a crowded afternoon? The possibilities each carried their own weight, none more unsettling than abduction. The decision was made to escalate. Amber alerts flashed across phones within the region, describing a 9-year-old boy last seen at the community pool. Helicopters took to the air, circling the surrounding woods and fields, their searchlights scanning tree canopies and creek beds. Ground units expanded their reach, knocking on doors of homes bordering the park, asking if anyone had seen a small child running, crying, or being led away. Volunteers poured in from town, forming impromptu search parties that fanned out in lines, calling the boy's name through the dusk. At the pool, the atmosphere was tense and fractured. The boy's parents stood near the entrance, flanked by officers who tried to keep them calm. His mother refused to sit, her eyes locked on the still water that seemed to mock her, as though it might at any moment give back what it had taken. His father's hands trembled as he tried to answer questions about his son's last movements, what he was wearing, whether he could swim well, if he had any enemies, anything that might explain this impossible situation. Each answer only emphasized the lack of clarity. By nightfall, the area was lit with floodlights. The once bustling pool deck was now eerily sterile, stripped of laughter and reduced to a crime scene. Forensic teams collected towels, sandals, and personal items, bagging them carefully as evidence. Officers documented footprints in the wet concrete that led nowhere. Neighbors gathered outside the police perimeter, murmuring about strangers they thought they'd seen near the park in recent weeks. Some recalled a man leaning against the fence earlier that day, though none could describe him in detail. Every suggestion added fuel to the suspicion of an outside predator. But even as abduction theories spread, the raw fact remained. There was no clear sign of anyone leaving with the boy, no trail through the grass, no footprints in the mud near the gates. It was as if he had dissolved into the humid summer air, leaving only silence behind. Detectives found themselves staring at the still, drained faces of lifeguards who had been on duty. Their whistles still hung from their necks, unused now, symbols of their failure to prevent what had unfolded under their watch. Each one repeated the same defense. They were trained, they had scanned the water constantly, they had no explanation for how the child slipped from sight. As midnight drew near, the initial frenzy slowed into grim exhaustion. The helicopters returned to their bases, the volunteer lines broke apart, and search teams regrouped to plan for the morning. Still, no trace of the boy had been found in the water, in the park, or in the neighborhood streets. Detectives knew the longer the clock ticked, the more unlikely a safe recovery became. Yet they were faced with the same unanswerable question that haunted every person on scene. How could a child vanish from a crowded pool with hundreds of eyes watching and leave behind no evidence at all? That night, officers admitted among themselves what they could not say to the family. This was no longer just a missing child. It was an unfolding mystery that defied the simplest logic. And the grim realization set in. If the answers hadn't been found in those crucial first hours, they might not be found at all. In the days that followed, investigators worked around the clock to make sense of what had happened at the pool. The most obvious explanation seemed, at first, to be drowning. Children disappeared under the water every year across the country, often in crowded conditions where no one noticed until it was too late. But the problem with that theory was simple. Despite repeated sweeps with divers, sonar, and forensic teams, no body had been found. The pool had been drained to waist level within hours of the disappearance, yet the water revealed nothing. Detectives wrestled with the impossibility. If he had drowned, his body should have been recovered almost immediately. The absence gnawed at them. The alternative, abduction, was far more sinister. A stranger slipping into a crowded pool area and walking out with a child seemed brazen, but not impossible. The gate had been locked after the alarm, but before that, hundreds of people had been coming and going. In the chaos of whistles, parents pulling children from the water, and lifeguards shouting, could someone have taken advantage of the confusion? Officers canvassed the parking lot, noting every car and license plate still present when they arrived. They interviewed people who had left earlier in the day, hoping someone might recall seeing a child being led away or forced into a vehicle. Nothing conclusive emerged, only fragments of memory blurred by panic. As the hours stretched into days, suspicions shifted again. If not drowning and not a stranger, then what about someone inside the pool? Detectives knew from experience that in cases like this, foul play often came from someone close. Parents, relatives, even older kids or staff could not be ruled out. The lifeguards, most of them teenagers working summer jobs, found themselves under uncomfortable scrutiny. Detectives pressed them hard, questioning whether they had been distracted, whether anyone had left their post, whether alcohol or drugs had played a role in their inattention. Each denied negligence, each repeated that they had done their duty, scanning the pool as trained. Still, the tension lingered. The idea that someone on duty had missed the signs of a drowning child seemed unbearable. Parents at the pool that day brought their own stories forward. Several recalled seeing a man loitering near the fence in the hours before the disappearance. He hadn't been swimming, hadn't come in, just lingered with his hands in his pockets, watching the children. Others said they thought they'd seen him walk away quickly after the whistles blew, though none could describe his face clearly. Police tried to track down this figure, canvassing neighborhoods, checking security cameras from nearby stores and gas stations. But the image of the loiterer became more rumor than fact, a phantom threaded through the community's fear. As the investigation dragged on, the media descended. News vans parked along the street, reporters crowding the gates, cameras flashing whenever the family emerged. Headlines screamed about the boys vanishing, speculating about predators, cover-ups, and police missteps. The once beloved pool was painted as cursed, a place where children disappeared without a trace. Attendance dropped overnight, families refusing to return to a site now tied to horror. What had been the heart of summer joy was reduced to a symbol of dread. For the boy's family, the coverage only deepened their torment. His mother clung to the hope that if nobody had been found, then maybe, just maybe, he was still alive somewhere. She replayed every moment of that day, asking herself if she had looked away too long, if she had missed some signal from her son. His father, by contrast, grew more convinced of foul play. He spoke publicly about abduction, about the possibility that someone had been watching their family, waiting for the perfect chance. Their grief diverged into two painful paths, one desperate for hope, the other consumed by anger. Detectives, caught between these possibilities, found themselves pulled into endless dead ends. Witness statements contradicted one another. Tips flooded hotlines, but rarely amounted to more than speculation. A few callers claimed they saw a child matching the boy's description in neighboring towns, at gas stations, in rest stops, but each sighting collapsed under scrutiny. Without physical evidence, the investigation felt like it was built on sand. Theories began to multiply outside the official case. Some residents believed the boy had slipped into a mechanical chamber beneath the pool, trapped in pipes or filtration systems that rescuers had overlooked. Others whispered about trafficking rings, pointing to unverified stories of vans seen near the highway that day. A darker undercurrent accused the parents themselves, repeating a cruel narrative familiar in missing child cases, that grief was staged, that the family knew more than they admitted. None of it was backed by proof, but rumors gained momentum in the vacuum left by unanswered questions. Weeks passed, each one stretching the family's torment. The boy's room remained untouched, his toys left where he had dropped them that morning before leaving for the pool. His backpack hung by the door, as though waiting for him to come home from school. Neighbors who once filled the house with casseroles and comfort began to withdraw, uneasy with the silence that seemed to have settled over everything. The absence became its own presence, suffocating and relentless. Detectives met with the family repeatedly, offering updates that rarely held substance. The mother clung to the possibility that nobody meant life. The father stared at the ground, his jaw clenched tight, as if preparing himself for the possibility that hope was just prolonging pain. Between them, the air grew heavy with unsaid words, with exhaustion that no amount of sleep could heal. By the end of the first month, the case had shifted from frantic urgency to a grim endurance. Theories still circled: drowning, abduction, foul play, negligence. But none fit seamlessly, none carried the weight of certainty. And with each passing day, the mystery hardened into something far more frightening: the sense that a child could vanish in front of hundreds of people, and no one, not even trained investigators, could explain how. Summer returned the following year, but the atmosphere at the pool was nothing like it had been before. Where once the gates had opened to a flood of families, now only a trickle of visitors came through. The smell of chlorine was still heavy in the air, the sun still glared down on the concrete, but the laughter was gone. Parents avoided eye contact, children whispered nervously about the boy who had vanished, and lifeguards sat stiff in their chairs, their whistles untouched. The pool, once a sanctuary from the heat, had become a reminder of loss. Attendance dwindled further as word spread that the boy's disappearance was still unsolved. Families found other places to cool off: lakes, backyard pools, even staying home rather than risk the unease of stepping foot near the scene of the tragedy. What had once been the pride of the town became marked, as though a shadow lay across the deep end where he was last seen. Every splash was followed by anxious glances, every moment of silence by an edge of fear. Rumors began to take on a life of their own. Some whispered that the boy had been kidnapped by someone within the town, that there were secrets buried in plain sight. Others said his body must have been hidden, that someone had pulled strings to keep the truth buried. The more time passed, the less people believed in the simple explanations. The disappearance hardened into myth, shaping itself into stories retold at backyard barbecues and whispered among children who passed by the pool gates. It wasn't just an accident anymore. It had become a curse. The staff at the pool turned over year after year. Teenagers who had once dreamed of summer jobs there now avoided applying, fearful of the weight that came with the whistle and the chair. Those who did take the job often didn't last. The pressure was unbearable. Every watchful parent, every splash that sounded a little too loud, every child who went under for longer than expected, carried the weight of memory. Within weeks, many lifeguards quit, leaving the pool understaffed and unstable. Legal battles emerged as the family sought answers. Lawsuits were filed against the city, against the parks department, against the supervisors who had overseen the pool that day. Each case brought painful depositions, testimony about lifeguard training, safety protocols, and emergency responses. Lawyers argued about responsibility, about whether the city had failed in its duty of care. But without a body, without evidence of negligence beyond the unexplainable disappearance, cases fell apart in court. Judges dismissed claims, citing lack of proof, and appeals were quietly abandoned. Each failure left the family more isolated, their grief compounded by the sense that justice had slipped beyond reach. In the neighborhood, sympathy slowly eroded into distance. At first, the community had rallied around the family with vigils, donations, and endless casseroles dropped at their door. But as the years passed with no resolution, people stopped calling. Invitations to community events no longer arrived. The boy's absence was a wound too deep for others to face, and the family's persistence in searching became something people avoided rather than supported. They were left standing alone at the pool gates on each anniversary, laying flowers against the chain-link fence, their grief met with silence. Inside their home, the boy's belongings remained untouched. His bedroom froze in time, his favorite toys lined neatly on shelves, his bedspread patterned with superheroes faded by the sun. Each summer when the heat rose and the pool reopened, his mother sat in his room with the curtains drawn, listening to the muffled sounds of children playing outside, a reminder of what she had lost. His father threw himself into work, growing increasingly bitter, speaking less and less about his son, except to demand that police reopen old leads. Their marriage strained under the weight of years lived in limbo. For the rest of the town, the pool became a landmark of unease. Teenagers dared each other to sneak in at night, whispering about ghosts at the deep end. Parents told their children to stay away, saying it wasn't safe. Even maintenance crews complained of dread when they unlocked the gates in the morning, as though the air itself held on to the memory of that afternoon. Every summer it reopened, but every summer it felt more deserted, more haunted by what had been lost. The family's pain only deepened with time. Each new season without answers felt like another betrayal. They sat through town meetings demanding more be done, but with no evidence, no leads. Officials had little to offer. Detectives retired, files were boxed up, and the case drifted into the archives labeled cold. For the family, however, there was no such thing as cold. The mystery stayed burning, sharp as ever, cutting into every summer day that passed. By the 10th anniversary, the pool had become nearly empty of swimmers. Faded signs hung on the gates, the paint on the diving board cracked, and weeds grew in the cracks of the concrete deck. The town debated closing it altogether, citing declining revenue and upkeep costs. But whispers said the real reason was fear. Too many parents didn't want their children anywhere near the place. To them, it wasn't just a pool anymore. It was the last place a boy was ever seen alive. And so the summers rolled by in silence, the sound of splashing water replaced by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The mystery remained suspended in the heat, unanswered and unforgettable, until it felt less like an event and more like a presence. an unseen weight pressing down on the town each time the sun grew hot and the gates creaked open. It was a silence that couldn't be shaken, and though no one could have imagined it then, the truth lay closer than anyone realized, waiting for its moment to finally break the surface. By the 5th year after the boy's disappearance, the case had slipped from urgent headlines into the shadows of unsolved history. What had once commanded breaking news banners and round-the-clock interviews now occupied only a dusty folder on a detective's shelf. Leads that had once lit up phone lines and mobilized search teams were now reduced to scattered calls that rarely made it past the first screening. Detectives who had carried the case in its early days retired or were reassigned, handing the file off with little more than a weary sigh and a shrug. The new investigators glanced through the paperwork, already knowing the unspoken truth. Without new evidence, there was nothing more to do. For the parents, the silence was a slow suffocation. Each anniversary was marked not by balloons or celebrations, but by the walk to the pool gates. His mother carried flowers every year, always in the boy's favorite colors, arranging them against the chain-link fence where children still sometimes gathered to whisper about the day he vanished. His father stood beside her, less expressive, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his jaw locked tight. They stood in silence, side by side, but drifting further apart with each passing year. The pool itself remained almost abandoned, its lifeguard chairs empty most days, its diving boards cracking in the sun. Yet to the family, it remained the epicenter of their grief, a place where time had stopped and refused to start again. With the official investigation stalling, others stepped in to fill the vacuum. Psychics reached out to the parents, promising visions of where their son was hidden. Some said they saw him buried in shallow ground near the woods. Others claimed he was alive, living in another state under a different name. One insisted he was being held in a basement only a few towns away. Each claim carried a spark of hope that quickly fizzled under scrutiny. The police entertained a few of the more persistent tips, but each search ended the same way. Nothing. Amateur sleuths descended on the case, drawn by its haunting simplicity. A child disappearing in plain sight. Online forums filled with theories, some meticulously researched, others wild speculation. Posts argued over timelines, about how long a child could remain unseen underwater, about gaps in the lifeguards' testimonies, about the mysterious man who had supposedly lingered near the fence. Some users accused townspeople of hiding secrets, others painted elaborate scenarios involving organized trafficking rings. For the grieving parents, scrolling through these pages was both torturous and addictive. Every new theory was a lure, every debunking another blow. Conspiracy theorists pushed the boundaries further. Some claimed the boy had never been at the pool at all, that his disappearance was staged by the family for reasons no one could quite articulate. Others suggested he had stumbled onto something he wasn't meant to see, silenced by people with power. A few went so far as to say the pool itself was cursed, repeating old rumors until they became local folklore. These narratives spread faster than facts, reshaping the tragedy into something distorted and almost unrecognizable. The family bore the brunt of it. Strangers sent letters and emails filled with accusations, some demanding the parents confess, others begging them to search in unlikely places. Every time a tip surfaced, his mother would plead with police to chase it, no matter how improbable. Most were ignored, some followed briefly, all of them dead ends. Each false lead left her more fragile, her belief stretched thin between hope and despair. His father, hardened by years of disappointment, grew increasingly closed off, refusing to entertain theories that seemed designed only to reopen wounds. Their home became divided between obsession and avoidance, with neither finding comfort in the other's way of coping. Meanwhile, the town learned to move on, at least outwardly. Children grew into teenagers who barely remembered the day the pool had been cleared. Families who once avoided the gates now drove past without a second glance. The story lingered only in whispers, in the awkward silence that followed whenever the boy's name came up. The pool stood as a scar but not a wound, visible but no longer actively tended to. Only the family still carried the rawness, marking summers not by holidays or vacations, but by the absence that defined their lives. The parents clung to rituals as a way to survive. The flowers at the gate, the yearly interviews with dwindling media outlets, the occasional phone call to detectives asking if anything had changed. Each year the answer was the same: nothing. The word pressed heavier with time until it felt less like a response and more like a sentence. By the end of the 5th year, even hope began to feel dangerous. Each psychic vision, each amateur theory, each conspiracy whispered in the dark had taken something from the family. Instead of comfort, they brought only exhaustion. Instead of answers, they deepened the void. The silence that had followed the boy's disappearance had not lifted. It had expanded, growing louder with every year he failed to return. And yet, in that silence, something remained hidden. For while the case was treated as cold, the truth was not gone. It was waiting, buried in a place no one had dared to look, sealed away until time itself forced it back into the light. 12 years passed before anyone touched the pool in any meaningful way. By then, the once bustling centerpiece of the community had faded into something almost abandoned. Cracks lined the concrete deck, weeds pushed through the seams, and the paint that once shimmered bright blue beneath the water had dulled to a pale, uneven gray. The few families who still brought their children avoided the deep end altogether, whispering warning that carried a weight the children didn't fully understand. For most of the town, the place had become a monument to loss, tolerated but never embraced. And so when the city finally announced a full renovation, no one argued. It felt overdue, necessary to either reclaim the space or erase what it symbolized. The plan was simple: drain the pool, strip it to its foundation, and rebuild with modern safety standards. Contractors moved in with pumps, hoses, and equipment, ready to tackle what they assumed was just another aging structure. To them, it was routine work. The water would go, the concrete would be sanded, tiles replaced, drains refitted. At most, they expected to find layers of rust, maybe discarded toys, the odd soda can or handful of coins tossed in over the years. No one on the crew carried the weight of what had happened there. For them, the job was about structure, not tragedy. But news of the draining traveled quickly through town, and with it, whispers began to rise again. Some avoided the subject altogether, refusing to stir up old memories. Others speculated quietly about what might be revealed when the water was gone. A few dared to hope that at last the mystery might be solved, though most buried that thought before it could take root. No one wanted to reopen wounds that had scarred over, however poorly. For one person, though, the announcement pierced straight through years of silence. The boy's mother, now a decade older, frailer, her face lined with grief that had never lifted, heard about the renovations through a neighbor. She had never stopped marking the anniversaries, never stopped visiting the gates each summer. And though detectives had long since given up, though the case file had been shuffled into the category of unsolved, she could not shake the feeling that her son's story was not finished. When she learned the pool would be drained for the first time since the day he vanished, she knew she had to be there, even if only as a witness from a distance. She arrived quietly on the first morning of work. Standing across the street, hands clasped in front of her, she watched as pumps churned to life, water pouring through thick hoses into storm drains. The sound was steady, mechanical, almost indifferent, yet for her it carried an unbearable weight. Every gallon that left the pool felt like a peeling away of time, a slow exposure of secrets long hidden. Neighbors passed by without stopping, unwilling to linger, but she remained hour after hour, her eyes fixed on the receding waterline. Workers joked among themselves as the pool drained, tossing guesses about what they might find: bicycles, wallets, maybe even the odd animal carcass. To them, it was dark humor, a way to pass the hours of an otherwise uneventful job. None of them noticed the figure standing at a distance, clutching a small bouquet of flowers as though preparing for a vigil. They were not there to unearth mysteries. They were there to clear debris and ready the structure for new life. But beneath the surface, something stirred. As the water dropped lower, patches of grime and sediment became visible. Coins glinted faintly in the sunlight, candy wrappers stuck to the cracked tiles, and streaks of rust marked the aging drain covers. It looked ordinary, unremarkable, just as most had expected. Yet for those who carried the memory of what had happened there, even the sight of bare concrete carried an undercurrent of dread. For 12 years, the pool had been a sealed space, an unchanging body of water that resisted answers. Now, for the first time, its bones were being exposed. The boy's mother did not move closer. She remained across the street, her back straight despite the weight of years pressing down on her. She had told no one she would be there, not even her husband, who had long since stopped attending vigils. This was something she had to do alone. As the sun shifted and shadows lengthened, she held her gaze steady, as though by sheer will she could summon what had been hidden. In her heart, she did not expect a miracle. She only wanted the water gone, to know once and for all whether the pool had swallowed her child or whether the answer lay elsewhere. By the end of the day, the pool was nearly empty. The floor was slick with mud, the drains exposed for the first time in over a decade. Workers climbed down with boots and gloves, preparing to scrape away debris. They laughed lightly as they kicked through piles of silt, unconcerned, unknowing of the eyes watching from the street. The boy's mother tightened her grip on the flowers, her breath unsteady. She did not need to hear what they might find. She only needed to see the moment their laughter stopped. For 12 long years, silence had been the only answer offered by the pool. Now, with the water gone, that silence was about to be tested. And though no one standing inside the gates knew it yet, the truth that had been buried at the bottom was waiting, ready to surface at last. On the second day of work, the pool sat drained to its foundation, its once bright floor streaked with mud and rust. Workers climbed down ladders with boots sinking into the grime, carrying tools to scrape debris and replace the aging drains. At first, the tasks were routine. They scooped out coins dulled by years underwater, pulled up candy wrappers that had lodged against the walls, and tossed aside bits of plastic and broken goggles. It was exactly the kind of mess they expected after more than a decade without cleaning. But then the work shifted to the filtration system, and what they uncovered was something no one had been prepared for. One worker approached the main drain cover, rusted around the edges, and sealed tight from years of pressure. With a crowbar, he pried it loose, and a faint foul odor rose up with the release. At first, they assumed it was stagnant water trapped in the piping, but as the cover clanged against the concrete, the worker reached inside with gloves to pull free what looked like a tangle of fabric and debris. What emerged stopped him cold. It was not cloth or trash. It was bone. Small, fragile bones tangled together in a way that made no sense at first, until recognition set in. He staggered back, dropping the fragments onto the slick concrete. The laughter and chatter among the crew fell silent as others gathered around, staring at what had spilled out. It was unmistakable. These were human remains. Panic set in, not the kind born of danger, but the kind born of realization. They quickly called their supervisor, who ordered all work stopped. Within minutes, police were on scene, the pool once again surrounded by flashing lights, just as it had been 12 years earlier. Detectives, some of them retired but called back for their knowledge of the original case, stepped onto the deck with grim faces. They had chased leads across counties, questioned strangers, and investigated families. And now, the answer had been sitting here all along, hidden under their feet. Forensic specialists moved in carefully, gloved hands collecting the fragile bones from inside the drainage system. The remains were small, unmistakably those of a child. Mixed among them were fragments of fabric, worn thin and discolored, but still bearing faint traces of color and stitching. To the detectives, the recognition was instant. The clothing matched the description of what the boy had been wearing that day. Swim trunks bright with stripes, the kind every parent remembered seeing when he ran, laughing across the pool deck. Word of the discovery spread through the town like wildfire. Residents who had long buried the memory found themselves reliving it in an instant. For 12 years they had whispered about kidnappers, conspiracies, and cover-ups. Now the truth was far more haunting. The boy had never left the pool. He had been there the entire time, his body pulled into the powerful suction of an outdated drainage system that no one had thought to dismantle in the frantic hours after his disappearance. Parents wept openly as the news broke. Some felt guilt for spreading rumors that had once pointed fingers at others. Lifeguards who had worked that day called one another, their voices breaking as they realized the horror they had unknowingly presided over. The very place they had sworn to keep children safe had claimed a life in the most silent, hidden way possible. For the boy's mother, the call came from detectives who had once sat in her living room, offering empty reassurances. They told her the remains had been found, and though confirmation through forensics would take time, there was no doubt. She clutched the phone in silence, the flowers she had been preparing for another anniversary vigil slipping from her hand. All the years of imagining him far away, of hoping he might return, collapsed in an instant into a single truth. He had been only feet away, trapped, unseen, unheard while hundreds searched for him. At the pool, officers taped off the area, treating it as the crime scene it had always been but never revealed. Investigators photographed the drain system, documenting the rusted narrow pipes where suction had pulled and held the small body. Engineers were brought in to explain how such a thing could happen. They pointed to outdated designs, to suction forces powerful enough to trap even the strongest swimmer. It was a silent danger, one that had claimed lives elsewhere, but rarely in such a cruel, concealed way. The shock rippled beyond the town, reaching national news once again. For years, the boy's story had been a cold case, a haunting mystery whispered among locals. Now, it was something else entirely, a chilling reminder of how negligence and overlooked safety hazards could masquerade as something darker. Theories of abduction and conspiracy evaporated in the face of the grim physical evidence. The truth had been mundane in its mechanism, but devastating in its cruelty. As night fell, the pool stood in silence once more, floodlights illuminating the drained shell where workers had stumbled upon bones instead of debris. Detectives packed up evidence bags, each one containing pieces of a boy who had once splashed and laughed under the same lights. The case that had fractured a family, haunted a town, and confounded investigators had finally broken open. But what it revealed was not relief, not comfort, but a truth almost more unbearable than the mystery itself. Because after 12 years of searching outward, into woods, neighborhoods, and across counties, the answer had never left. It had waited, hidden in pipes and shadows, a silent presence beneath the water. And as the town absorbed the news, one thought spread in hushed, horrified voices. He had been there all along. Forensic specialists moved cautiously as they extracted the fragments of bone and fabric from the drain, every motion deliberate under the harsh glare of floodlights. What had begun as a renovation project was now a delicate recovery operation. Evidence bags filled with tiny bones, scraps of fabric, and hair strands were cataloged one by one, each piece handled with the same reverence reserved for a crime scene. But this was not a homicide investigation. It was something harder to comprehend, an accident concealed so thoroughly by mechanical force that it had masqueraded as something far darker. Engineers were brought in almost immediately. Standing on the drained floor of the pool, they explained to investigators how outdated drainage systems like this one had once been installed across the country. Unlike modern safety drains, which were required to have protective covers and multiple outlets to reduce suction, these older designs had a single, powerful intake. The force could pin a swimmer to the bottom if they became caught, creating a trap nearly impossible to escape. To a child, especially one full of energy and confidence, it was an invisible danger, indistinguishable from the rest of the pool floor until it was too late. The investigators listened as diagrams were sketched, the mechanism broken down step by step. They realized that on that afternoon, years earlier, the boy had likely swam near the drain, perhaps diving to retrieve a toy or simply testing how long he could stay under. In an instant, the suction would have gripped him, pulling him down and holding him in place. Panic underwater is silent, muffled by the surface above. Even if he thrashed, no one would have noticed in the chaos of a busy summer afternoon. By the time lifeguards blew whistles and parents began to call his name, he was already trapped where no one could see. Autopsy reports confirmed what the engineers had suspected. The small bones bore no signs of trauma, no fractures, no marks of restraint. The evidence pointed to drowning, the lungs having filled with water in those final desperate moments. Forensic analysts compared fabric samples to the description of his striped swim trunks, and the match was undeniable. There were no signs of abduction, no evidence of assault. The cause of death was accidental, hidden only by the brutal efficiency of the pool's mechanical system. What horrified investigators most was the realization that the boy's body had been present all along, concealed by the very system meant to keep the pool clean. When the divers scoured the water that first day, they had swum above him. When officers drained the pool halfway, they had unknowingly revealed everything except the pipes where his remains were lodged. Every rumor, every theory of abduction, every suspicion cast on neighbors or strangers had been built on an absence that was never real. The pool had claimed him and held on tight, its silence convincing the town to look everywhere but down. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Parents who had once blamed lifeguards for negligence were now faced with the truth that no human error could have uncovered. The boy had not been missed through carelessness. He had been hidden by the design of the structure itself. The lifeguards, many of whom had carried guilt into adulthood, learned that there was likely nothing they could have done. Even trained divers would have been unable to spot what the suction had concealed. Relief mixed uneasily with horror, for while they were absolved, the truth was no less devastating. Residents gathered in small clusters across town, talking in hushed tones. Some admitted they had convinced themselves of abduction, because it was easier to imagine a human villain than to accept that a simple piece of outdated equipment had robbed a child of his life. Others wept at the cruelty of it, the way an accident had been transformed into a mystery that tormented a family for more than a decade. For the boy's parents, the truth was unbearable. They had begged officers to search harder, to drain the pool fully, to consider every possibility. Now they knew that in all their years of imagining kidnappers and conspiracies, their son had been only feet away, his small body wedged in silence, waiting for someone to find him. Investigators compiled their final reports with grim clarity. The cause of death was accidental drowning, exacerbated by entrapment in the pool's drain system. The mechanical suction had acted like a lock, holding the boy's body tight until decomposition, over years, left behind only the skeletal remains and scraps of fabric that were finally recovered. No evidence suggested foul play. No human had taken him. The tragedy had been born of outdated engineering and overlooked danger. When the findings were announced publicly, outrage and sorrow intertwined. Parents demanded to know how such a hazard had been allowed to remain in place. Lawsuits reignited, this time with firmer footing, pointing to negligence not of lifeguards or neighbors, but of the city's failure to modernize its facilities. Across the country, officials at other pools began re-examining their own systems, fearful that another child might be trapped in the same way. For the town itself, the revelation reshaped 12 years of pain. The whispers of kidnappers, the suspicion cast on neighbors, the fractures in community trust, all of it had been built on a false foundation. The truth was simpler, but far crueler in its simplicity. It was not malice that had taken the boy, but machinery. And yet, knowing the truth did not quiet the grief. Instead, it deepened it, because it proved what no one wanted to believe. The mystery had never left the pool. It had been locked in the pipes, hidden until time itself forced it back into view. When the truth was finally spoken aloud, the boy's family found themselves thrown back into the same grief they had endured 12 years earlier, only sharper, crueler. For more than a decade they had lived in a limbo of uncertainty, imagining kidnappers, traffickers, and endless scenarios of what might have happened to their child. That pain had been unbearable, but it had also left room for fragments of hope. Now, with forensic reports confirming he had never left the pool, that fragile hope was destroyed. Their son had been just feet away the entire time, silenced not by strangers, but by machinery and negligence. His mother could not comprehend it. For years she had sat at the pool gates, whispering his name, believing he might still be alive somewhere. The realization that her flowers, her vigils, her desperate prayers had all been laid at the very site where his body had been trapped broke her completely. His father, once hardened into bitterness, now collapsed under the weight of knowing he had blamed the wrong people, followed the wrong leads, and wasted years of his life raging in the shadows. Their grief was not softened by answers. It was sharpened, reopened like a wound that had never healed. Across town, guilt spread like a second tragedy. Neighbors remembered the rumors they had repeated, suspicions of abduction, whispers that the parents themselves might have known more than they admitted. Lifeguards, now grown adults, came forward in tears, confessing they had carried the memory of that day like a stone in their chest, believing for years they had failed to see what should have been obvious. Learning that no amount of vigilance could have changed what happened did not erase their guilt. It only added another layer of torment. They had kept watch over a pool that was designed to hide its own danger. The lawsuits reignited, this time with focus and fury. The family and their lawyers argued not about negligence in supervision, but about outdated infrastructure, about a system that should have been replaced long before tragedy struck. The town braced itself for years of legal battles, but the damage to its reputation was already permanent. The revelation did not heal wounds. It carved them deeper, leaving scars that would never fade. And as the family stood in court, staring at photographs of the drain that had stolen their son, one thought burned through everything. The truth had come far too late. The conclusion of the case was not the unveiling of a criminal conspiracy or the capture of a predator, but something both simpler and more devastating. The boy's disappearance had not been orchestrated by a stranger slipping through the gates or by someone within the community harboring secrets. It was a preventable tragedy, hidden in plain sight, created by a design flaw in the very structure meant to provide safety and joy. For 12 years, the truth had been locked beneath the surface, concealed by pipes and suction that no one thought to dismantle, until the day the water was finally drained and forced to surrender what it had taken. The revelation arrived too late for justice. No one could be held criminally responsible for a system installed decades earlier. No one could answer for the fact that the drain had remained unchanged. But it was not too late for change. Across the country, safety commissions and lawmakers responded with urgency. Regulations were tightened, outdated drains removed, new covers and systems required by law. Engineers testified before committees, using the boy's story as a grim reminder of what negligence and oversight could cost. His tragedy became a catalyst, ensuring no other family would endure the same torment. For the parents, closure was a hollow word. Answers did not return their son, and reforms did not erase the years of suspicion, grief, and false hope. Yet the silence that had haunted them was broken. They finally knew where he had been, how his life had ended, and why no one had been able to find him. It was a truth that hurt deeply, but it was a truth nonetheless. And for them, knowing was better than the endless emptiness of not knowing at all. The final image that lingers is not of detectives cracking the case or of neighbors uncovering hidden clues, but of water, still and unyielding, holding a secret it should never have kept. The boy's story ended not with discovery through skill or persistence, but with time itself, eroding the silence until the answer could no longer stay buried. A mystery that had haunted a town for over a decade was solved, not by investigation, but by the draining of a pool that revealed what had been there all along.